For centuries, sailors spoke of one place in hushed tones, a stretch of coastline where ambition met its final test, the Cape of Good Hope. On the surface, it's just a rugged point of land at Africa's southern edge, but out on the water, it becomes something else entirely. This is where two great oceans collide, where calm seas flip into chaos in minutes, and where even experienced captains prayed before crossing. Thousands of ships tried to round this cape. Many never returned. Their bones, and sometimes the people on board, still lie beneath these waters. One of those ships carried over 600 souls. Only a fraction survived. What happened to them remains one of the most haunting tragedies in maritime history. Before this cape became a graveyard, it became a gateway. A vital passage for empires, explorers, and anyone bold or desperate enough to challenge the edge of the known world. And to understand why so many risked everything, we first need to see where this legendary headland truly begins. The Cape of Good Hope sits along South Africa's southern coastline, a little over 70 kilometers from Cape Town. For generations, maps showed it as the southernmost point of the African continent, but that title actually belongs to Cape Agulhas, roughly 150 kilometers farther to the southeast. Even so, sailors treated the Cape of Good Hope as the continent's great turning point, the moment a long descent down the west coast finally swung east toward the Indian Ocean. For anyone sailing between Europe and Asia, that bend mattered. It was a psychological checkpoint as much as a geographical one. Past this point, and the most dangerous stretch of the journey was either just behind you or directly ahead. The cape itself rises from the sea in dramatic fashion. Sheer cliffs, restless surf, wind that scrapes low vegetation flat. Today, this dramatic landscape forms part of Table Mountain National Park, drawing thousands who come for the scenery. But for mariners, the view has always been secondary to its position. Depending on the weather, the cape could open a pathway across oceans or seal it shut. For centuries of European-Asian trade, rounding this single headland meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. And that dynamic, gateway or trap, set the stage for the earliest encounters explorers would have with these waters, leading us into the age of European expansion around Africa. Long before Europeans appeared on the horizon, the Cape was already home to the Khoikhoi. For them, this coastline wasn't a gateway, an obstacle, or a strategic waypoint. It was simply the land that sustained their herds and communities for generations. The cliffs, the wind, the surf, they were part of daily life, not symbols of danger or ambition. That meaning shifted dramatically in the late 15th century. European powers, most urgently Portugal, were locked in a race to find a sea route to Asia. Spices, silk, and wealth flowed through the east, but reaching them by land was costly, limited, and often impossible. A route by sea promised not just profit, but dominance. In 1488, a Portuguese navigator, Bartolomeu Dias, became the first known European to round the southern end of Africa. Ironically, he didn't intend to. A violent storm blew his ships far off their intended course. When the weather finally cleared, Dias realized he had drifted around the bottom of the continent. He named the place the Cape of Storms, a blunt assessment from someone who had just survived its fury with no charts, no instruments, and only a wooden hull between him and the ocean. But Portugal's king saw the moment differently. If this headland opened a sea path to India, then it wasn't a place of doom. It was a symbol of possibility. He renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, and that new name carried weight. Overnight, these waters became one of the most fiercely contested corridors on Earth. Anyone who could pass this point could reach the east and control some of the world's richest trade. More nations entered the competition, more ships pushed into the route, and with them came more confrontations, more ambition, and more disasters, setting the stage for the next era of empire building around the Cape. By the 1600s, the sea route between Europe and Asia had become a massive business, but it was also brutally demanding. Ships couldn't complete the journey in a single push. They needed places to rest, refill fresh water, gather food, and treat sailors weakened by months at sea. And that's where the Cape entered a new chapter. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, established a small resupply station at the Cape, on the site of what would eventually become Cape Town. The location was almost too perfect, the midpoint between Europe and the East Indies. Dutch ships could stop, take on supplies, and then continue their long haul across the Indian Ocean. Then came the late 18th century, when Europe was reshaped by the Napoleonic Wars. In 1795, worried the French might seize the settlement, Britain occupied the Cape to block that possibility. Control briefly shifted, but by 1806 the British returned, this time securing the region for good. For the British Empire, the Cape was far more than a rest stop. It was a strategic lever. Whoever controlled this headland could monitor, influence, or even choke off a major portion of the world's maritime trade. In an era of wooden ships and voyages that lasted months, that kind of leverage was geopolitical power in its purest form. But that dominance wouldn't last unchanged. A new shortcut, one carved through the deserts of Egypt, would soon challenge the Cape's status as the world's essential passageway, leading us toward the next major shift in its story. If the Cape of Good Hope earned its reputation as a sailor's nightmare, it wasn't by accident. This headland sits at the collision point of two enormous ocean systems, the Atlantic and the Indian. Where they meet, they don't blend gently. They churn, twist, and generate some of the most unstable waters on the planet. Adding to that instability is the Agulhas Current, a powerful ribbon of warm water sweeping down from the northeast. When it interacts with cold Atlantic swells, sudden gales, and dense fog banks, the result is a volatile mix, essentially a recipe for disaster. Winds can swing direction with almost no warning. A quiet morning can erupt into a violent storm by late afternoon. And the waves? Some rise high enough to swallow small ships outright. Early sailors had almost nothing to help them interpret these shifts. No weather forecasts, no radar, only rough charts, experience passed down from older crews, and hope. That wasn't always enough. It's estimated that more than 2,500 ships have been lost along the South African coast, with a significant portion wrecked near the Cape. And that number reflects only the documented cases. Many more lie undiscovered, some scattered across remote shorelines, others resting intact far below the surface. These weren't just accidents, many became legends, stories of misfortune that hardened the Cape's reputation, and even inspired ghost tales that sailors repeated for centuries. And among those tales, one phantom ship stands above all the rest, leading us directly into the most famous legend ever linked to these waters. One of the most enduring legends tied to the Cape begins in 1641. A Dutch vessel, fighting its way around the headland, was caught in a brutal storm. The ship's captain, identified in some versions as Hendrik van der Decken, was sailing home from the East Indies when the weather turned savage. Waves smashed across the deck, the sails ripped to shreds, and the crew, terrified, begged him to turn back. But the captain refused. According to the tale, he lashed himself to the helm and swore he would round the Cape no matter what, declaring that not even God could stand in his way. And that defiance, the story goes, was heard. A divine figure, sometimes described as the Holy Ghost, appeared in a beam of light on the deck. The captain drew a pistol and fired. His arm withered instantly. In that moment, the ship was cursed to wander the waters around the Cape forever, forbidden to make landfall, doomed to sail without end. From then on, sailors believed that spotting the ghostly silhouette of the Flying Dutchman was a terrible omen. Crewmen claimed to see a glowing ship racing through impossible seas, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. These sightings persisted for centuries, even into the 20th century, when naval officers still swore they'd glimpsed something in the mist. Of course, the Flying Dutchman is legend. but the dangers it symbolizes are very real. The waters around the Cape hold countless wrecks, some still scattered across lonely beaches, others swallowed whole by the sea. And among those real tragedies are stories far more devastating than myth. The first catastrophe takes us to December 27, 1794, when the Portuguese slave ship São José, Paquete d'Africa, was caught in a violent storm near Cape Town. It had departed Mozambique earlier that month, carrying more than 500 enslaved men, women, and children bound for Brazil. Just days into the journey, heavy seas near the Cape slammed the vessel onto submerged rocks off what is now Clifton Beach. A rope line to shore allowed some of the crew and over 200 enslaved people to reach land. But more than half of those on board drowned, trapped below deck or swept away in the surf. And for the survivors, reaching the beach did not bring freedom. They were immediately sold back into slavery. For over 2 centuries, the ship's resting place remained unknown. Only recently did archaeologists, working with the Slave Wrecks Project and Eziko Museums of South Africa, identify the site. Today it stands as a stark reminder of the Cape's entanglement in the transatlantic slave trade and the human cost hidden beneath these waters. 2 decades later came another tragedy, one caused not by storms but by a navigational blind spot. The Arniston, a large British East Indiaman, was carrying soldiers and their families home from Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka. In May 1815, rough seas along the southern coast forced the ship off course, but the real danger lay in what the vessel lacked: a marine chronometer. Without this essential tool for determining longitude, the crew relied on guesswork, dead reckoning. Believing they were safely west of the hazards, the captain steered toward shore. They were disastrously wrong. Arniston crashed into a reef near present-day Wanhuiskrans, breaking apart in the surf. Out of 378 people on board, only 6 survived. The public outrage in Britain accelerated efforts to equip all naval and merchant ships with proper chronometers. The nearby town was later renamed Arniston in memory of the lives lost. In 1842, the convict ship Waterloo anchored in what should have been a safe haven, Table Bay, just off Cape Town, en route to Australia with more than 300 people, most of them prisoners. But safety in the Cape is always conditional. A sudden gale swept through the bay, driving the vessel onto the rocks. The hull ruptured, waves pounded the ship apart, and many prisoners remained locked below deck as the chaos unfolded. Rescue efforts came too late. Roughly half the people on board died, many within sight of land. The disaster shook the colony. It exposed the harsh conditions aboard convict transports and the dangers of anchoring in Table Bay during storms. Calls for better emergency procedures and more humane treatment of prisoners soon followed. A decade later, another disaster struck, one remembered for its discipline as much as its loss. In 1852, HMS Birkenhead was carrying British troops and their families when it struck an uncharted rock near Gansby, just off the Cape of Good Hope. The iron hull tore open, water flooded in, and there were far too few lifeboats. The soldiers quickly understood the situation. If they rushed the boats, the women and children would die. And so they stood fast, shoulder to shoulder on the listing deck, while the lifeboats were filled with families first. Only 193 of the roughly 643 people aboard survived. The act of self-sacrifice became known as the Birkenhead Drill, shaping evacuation protocols for generations. It remains one of the most powerful displays of duty in maritime history. In 1874, a large 3-masted sailing ship set out from England toward New Zealand, carrying 472 immigrants seeking a new life. Weeks after passing the Cape, tragedy erupted below deck, a fire that tore through the wooden ship with terrifying speed. The vessel became a floating inferno. Crew fought the flames, passengers scrambled for the few lifeboats, and many were trapped beneath collapsing timbers. In the end, only 3 people survived. Even those who reached lifeboats endured starvation, dehydration, and unimaginable suffering before succumbing to the ocean. It became one of the deadliest immigrant ship disasters in British maritime history, and a grim prelude to an even stranger case involving a much more modern vessel. By 1909, steamships had made voyages faster and safer. The Waratah, a luxury passenger steamer known as the Titanic of the Southern Seas, was among the pride of the region's fleet. In July that year, it left Durban for Cape Town with over 200 people on board. It never arrived. Somewhere along the notoriously violent stretch between East London and Cape Town, the ship vanished. No distress signal, no debris field, no survivors. Multiple searches by ship and by aircraft uncovered nothing. To this day, the disappearance remains one of South Africa's greatest maritime mysteries. Theories abound: rogue waves, sudden capsizing, shifting cargo, severe weather. But none have been proven. The event rattled the maritime world and highlighted once again the need for stronger safety measures around the Cape. And those safety measures, the ones that would reshape navigation along this coastline, form the next chapter in the Cape's long and unforgiving history. By the early 20th century, the long list of wrecks around the Cape had forced a change in thinking. For centuries, mariners had simply accepted the risks, storms, currents, rocks, and the sheer unpredictability of the region. But after so many losses, governments could no longer treat disaster as an unavoidable part of ocean travel. The focus shifted from enduring danger to actively preventing it. One of the first major steps was expanding the lighthouse network. New beacons were built along the coastline, and older ones were upgraded to cast stronger, more reliable light. The Cape Point Lighthouse, perched high above the sea, became especially important, its beam able to cut through fog, rain, and the powerful gusts that often swallowed lesser lights. But illumination alone wasn't enough. Authorities also began investing heavily in navigation infrastructure. Nautical charts were redrawn with greater accuracy. Weather monitoring improved. Communication systems became more dependable. Slowly, the age of guesswork, of relying purely on instinct and experience, started to give way to something more scientific. Even then, the ocean had the last word. Modern tools reduced the dangers, but they could never erase them. Around the Cape, conditions still change fast, storms still build out of nowhere, and the landscape still commands caution. And while these improvements made the route safer, a new challenge was emerging to redefine the Cape's role entirely. A man-made shortcut that would rewire global trade and shift the spotlight away from Africa's southern tip. In 1869, everything changed. The opening of the Suez Canal carved a man-made shortcut between Europe and Asia, one that bypassed the long, dangerous loop around the Cape entirely. Suddenly, ships could slip through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean, cutting weeks off their journey. What had once been an unavoidable detour at the bottom of Africa was no longer required. The impact was immediate. Trade routes that had depended on rounding the Cape for centuries were redirected almost overnight. Ports along the Old Passage saw fewer sails on the horizon. The Cape's status as a global choke point began to fade. Whenever the Suez Canal was blocked by war, political tension, or even a single massive container ship wedged sideways, the Cape route became vital again. Even in calm years, certain vessels still avoided Suez. Ships too large, tankers carrying hazardous cargo, and naval fleets that preferred the open ocean over confined waterways. So the Cape transformed. It went from the only path between worlds to the one path you could always count on when everything else went wrong. And while global trade moved on, the Cape itself entered yet another chapter, one defined not by empire or shipwrecks, but by the power of its landscape and the enduring pull it has on anyone who visits. Today, the Cape of Good Hope is no longer the lifeline of global sea trade, but it still leaves a powerful impression. As part of Table Mountain National Park, the area draws visitors with its towering cliffs, rugged trails, and sweeping ocean views that seem to run straight off the edge of the continent. Every year, thousands of people travel here to stand where countless ships once passed in fear, hope, or desperation. A simple sign marks the spot. The Cape of Good Hope, the most southwestern point of the African continent. For many, it's a bucket list photo, but behind the sign is a place layered with meaning. The Cape is a symbol of discovery, danger, ambition, and endurance. To early European explorers, it was the edge of the known world. For centuries of trade, it was a choke point that shaped empires. Walk the coastline today, and the past still lingers. And even with modern navigation, the Cape hasn't softened. Ships still round it, storms still build fast, and its sheer presence still captures the imagination of anyone who looks out over the restless water. The Cape of Good Hope remains one of the most story-filled places on Earth, a crossroads where maritime history, myth, human tragedy, and technological progress intersect. Few coastlines have witnessed so much and remembered so vividly, and the journey doesn't end here. There are more untold stories, lost ships, forgotten explorers, and legends that shape the way we understand the sea, all waiting in the videos ahead. If you'd like to keep exploring these hidden corners of history, consider subscribing. Your support helps bring more of these deep dives to life and keeps this journey going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.